They tied her to a post, calling her a worthless, until her billionaire husband showed up in a helicopter, and what he did? Everyone's speechless. I'm your storyteller, James, and I truly hope you're doing well today. Before we dive into this deeply emotional tale, I have one simple question for you. Where in the world are you listening to me from right now? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know where my voice is reaching your heart, and if this story touches even a piece of your soul. If you believe that broken people can rise, that love can heal, and that courage has a name, then please join James's family. Hit that subscribe button, not just for stories, but for strength, for hope, and for voices that matter. Let's grow this family into a place where every story makes someone feel seen. Now, what if the woman they once called worthless became a queen not in crowns but in hearts? What if love didn't just rescue her but rebuilt the world around her? Stay with me till the very end, because this story will not just move you. It might just change you. Let's dive into it. Zariah Bloom stood alone, her body trembling under the relentless blaze of the midday sun, tied tightly to a rough, splintered wooden post erected in the very center of the village square, where she once ran barefoot as a child, now standing as a symbol of disgrace in the eyes of those who had turned against her with such venom that it soaked the air like poison. Her skin, a warm and radiant shade of smooth brown, was now marked by bruises, cuts, and smudges of mud thrown by the very people she once greeted with innocent smiles, people who now circled her with fire in their eyes and stones in their hands, hurling cruel words that pierced her spirit deeper than the ropes bound to her wrists. Her once elegant dress, made of soft cream fabric that had once brushed against her skin like the gentle breeze of dawn, was now torn at the shoulder, hanging in disgrace like a banner of shame, stained with dirt and bits of rotten vegetables flung at her by merciless villagers, some of whom were her former schoolmates, others the elders she had once helped with daily chores, and even children. Yes, children pointed fingers and laughed at her as if she were some traveling clown meant for their amusement. Zariah's feet, bare and blistered from being dragged across the rocky path that led from her stepmother's cottage to the square, stood planted in the dry, cracked earth, the texture of the soil crumbling beneath her as though it too was ashamed to hold her upright. Above her the sun burned mercilessly, yet no one offered her shade or water, not even pity, only sneers and spat words, and that was somehow worse than the blows. "You brought this upon yourself," hissed the voice of cruelty that had haunted her since she was a girl. Her stepmother, Mrs. Bloom, a woman whose heart was made of steel wrapped in silk, whose resentment towards Zariah grew with each year she bloomed into the kind of beauty that stole attention in a room, and who now stood just a few feet away with her hands on her hips, glaring as if her stepdaughter's agony fed her soul. "You're nothing but shame to this land," she said again, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Thinking you could marry some rich foreigner and walk back here like a queen. You're filth, and you'll die filth." The villagers murmured their agreement, their pitchfork hearts echoing her hatred, some picking up stones to throw, others clenching their fists and tossing moldy bread, or worse, cold spit. Each blow and insult hurled at her felt like a brick pressed against her chest. But Zariah didn't scream, she didn't cry, not because she was unbreakable, but because she had endured worse behind closed doors where no one came to save her. Not when her stepmother locked her out at night, not when she worked for hours in fields under blazing heat without water, and certainly not when rumors swirled about her secret marriage to a man no one had ever seen. The mayor, a heavy, red-faced man named Vexlin, stepped forward and waved his hand dramatically to hush the crowd, puffing out his chest as if he were delivering judgment from a golden throne, when in reality he was a man whose corruption was hidden beneath layers of false righteousness. He pointed a crooked finger at Zariah, his voice loud and theatrical. This woman brought dishonor to our village by marrying a foreigner who probably doesn't even exist. She returned with gold in her ears and perfume in her clothes, expecting us to welcome her like royalty. But what did she do for us? Nothing. She betrayed her roots. The crowd erupted in cruel agreement, stomping feet and clapping as if watching a play, and no one questioned the lie he had just told, because it was easier to mock someone else than to face their own bitterness and fear of being left behind. Zariah's lips trembled, but still no sound escaped. Inside, her heart beat like a whisper, begging to be heard, a quiet prayer wrapped in fear and pain. Please, God, just let this end. Give me a sign that I'm not alone. And somewhere deep inside her, a flame of hope remained, however small, however faint, that someone, anyone, might still believe she was more than this humiliation. But the villagers weren't done. One woman, Marta, who had once borrowed Zariah's scarf and never returned it, spat at her feet and shouted, "Did your husband buy that pretty skin too, or did you earn it lying on your back?" The crowd roared in laughter, and the mockery stabbed deeper than the bruises on her arms, because they weren't just mocking her, they were mocking her love, her truth, her worth. Another child, no older than 6, threw a stone and yelled, "Witch!" And Zariah looked into his eyes and saw the seeds of hate already taking root, planted by the adults who surrounded him like weeds choking a flower. Her legs ached from standing too long, wrists chafed and raw, stomach empty for hours, and yet still she stood, because collapsing now would be surrendering the last shred of dignity she had left. They didn't just want her tied to that post. They wanted to erase her, to burn her name from memory, to convince themselves that someone like her didn't belong in the world of wealth, love, or success. Because if she did, then maybe their lives were a lie. But Zariah knew better. She had loved and been loved deeply. She had danced in candlelight with a man whose touch made the stars weep. She had stood on balconies and whispered dreams into the night sky. And even now, bruised and broken, she carried something they would never understand: hope. And then, as if summoned by her final silent plea, something shifted in the air. A deep rumble rolled across the sky like the growl of a sleeping beast, awoken, low at first, but growing louder, stronger, causing chickens to scatter and old men to look up nervously. The villagers paused, their taunts faltering as dust kicked up from the distant fields, followed by a shimmering silver silhouette against the blue horizon. It glided like a ghost over the treetops, sleek and powerful, its engines slicing the air with elegance and command, and then it came into view. A private jet, unlike anything the village had ever seen, its body gleaming under the sun like a fallen star. Mouths gaped open, fingers pointed skyward. "What in heaven's name is that?" someone gasped. The jet circled once overhead, casting a giant shadow over the square, and the people below froze, their confidence crumbling with every passing second as they realized this wasn't just a coincidence. It was something, or someone, meant for her. Zariah felt it in her bones, the way her breath caught, the way her heart beat in slow, heavy thuds. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The roar of the private jet slicing through the open village sky fell into an eerie hush as the massive aircraft began descending toward the open field just beyond the mango grove, its sleek metallic body gleaming like a blade dipped in moonlight, casting long shadows over the stunned crowd below, who had only moments ago been united in cruelty and were now nothing but statues of confusion and growing dread. No one moved, not even the wind, as the jet's landing gear gently kissed the dry earth with a grace that didn't belong to this place. This was not a sky that had ever welcomed royalty, not a field that had ever dreamed of tasting luxury. And yet here it was, unfolding like a movie no villager could comprehend. The jet's turbines let out a gentle hum before powering down completely, and a flight attendant in a crisp silver uniform stepped forward to open the door, holding it wide as a figure emerged from within the shadows, tall and imposing, every movement deliberate, controlled, and dripping with unspoken power. He stepped onto the retractable stairs slowly, his jet-black designer coat flowing behind him like a cloak of vengeance. And as the sun reflected off his polished shoes, the first clear look at his face stole the breath from every spectator. Chiseled jawline dusted with a well-groomed beard, sharp cheekbones, and the kind of piercing blue eyes that didn't ask questions. They commanded answers. His presence alone silenced the lingering whispers, and when his eyes finally locked onto the sight in the village square, Zariah, still tied to the post, her once proud posture wilted by hours of torment, his steps turned swift and lethal, the sound of his boots hitting the earth like war drums as he walked straight toward the scene, parting the stunned crowd like a furious tide meeting helpless debris. The villagers who had moments ago been spitting venom now stumbled backward without a word, some lowering their heads, others gripping their children's shoulders and pushing them aside as if shielding them from something too powerful to look at directly. Yet not one dared to stop him, for there was something in the air now, something that smelled like justice, fury, and retribution wrapped in Armani. Leonard Drake did not blink as he approached the post, his eyes fixed solely on Zariah, as if the rest of the world didn't matter, as if the scorched earth, the broken voices, and the poisonous judgment surrounding her no longer existed. And when he reached her, his steps halted with a sharp finality, and for a heartbeat, time stood still. Zariah, who had not moved in hours, felt her heart leap and stutter at once, her bruised eyes meeting his as tears welled, not from pain but from the sheer disbelief of seeing him, her husband, her truth, her salvation, standing before her like a knight forged from fire. He said nothing at first, just stared at the torn fabric on her shoulder, the red marks on her wrists, the dirt on her feet, and the trembling in her bottom lip that she tried so hard to control. His hands reached out, and for the first time, they weren't the strong, possessive hands of the world's most powerful CEO. They were trembling, shaking with fury and helplessness as he touched her wrists, his thumbs brushing gently over the raw skin with a tenderness so sharp it broke her. He pulled a sleek black knife from his coat and sliced the rope with precision, catching her fragile body in his arms before she could fall, holding her close to his chest, as if shielding her from the very air around them. And then, finally, he spoke, his voice a low growl that cut through the silence like thunder over the sea. Who did this to her? The words were not screamed, yet they carried more weight than 100 shouts, so much so that even the mayor took a staggering step back. Leonard's eyes, once soft for Zariah, now turned cold and razor-sharp as they scanned the faces around him. The crowd looked away in shame, some trembling, others trying to fade into the background, but none could escape the gravity of what was coming. The mayor, now visibly sweating beneath his heavy coat, stammered, We were just—" But his voice died when Leonard's gaze snapped to him like a loaded weapon. Still cradling Zariah in one arm, Leonard took a single step forward and said darkly, You called her worthless. The words dripped venom, and silence followed like a held breath. You mocked the woman I would die for. Another pause, his tone like ice cracking beneath heavy boots. This village will remember this moment forever, not because of what you did, but because of what I'm about to do. He turned slightly to adjust Zariah in his arms, brushing the hair from her face with heartbreaking gentleness, and whispered into her ear, It's over, love. I've got you now. Then, without waiting another second, he turned his back on the crowd and began walking, every step deliberate and silent, as the weight of his presence followed behind him like a storm cloud. The villagers watched with wide eyes as he carried her, stunned and speechless, as if unable to reconcile the image of the humiliated girl with the powerful man who now held her like a queen. Some stepped aside instinctively, others fell to their knees, and still others whispered prayers under their breath, as though hoping to be spared from the wrath surely coming their way. Leonard walked with purpose through the village path, boots crushing the same dirt that had once been thrown at Zariah's feet, until he reached the field where the jet awaited, with its engine still warm, and the attendant holding the door open as if sensing the urgency. He climbed the steps with Zariah still in his arms, and just before ducking into the cabin, he looked over his shoulder one last time. And though his words were quiet, they echoed like cannon fire in the hearts of everyone present. You touched the woman I love. You broke her body, but not her soul. And now, I'll rebuild her in gold. And your names? I won't forget them. With that, he disappeared inside the jet, the door closing behind him with a hiss that sounded far too much like a threat. Within seconds, the engines roared to life once more, a wall of wind and dust blasting through the field as the aircraft began to rise, lifting Zariah away from the ashes of her dignity towards something far more powerful, a reckoning, a rebirth, and a love that would ignite a war if necessary. The jet soared above the clouds, the world below fading into insignificance, as silence wrapped around the luxury cabin like a warm, protective cocoon, far removed from the cruelty they had just escaped. Inside, Zariah lay across the buttery soft leather seat that curved like a cradle beneath her, her delicate frame barely moving, her head resting gently on Leonard's lap, where his hand moved tenderly through her long, dark braids, his thumb brushing her temple as if memorizing every inch of her pain with the gentlest reverence a man could give. The lights inside the aircraft were dimmed, golden and soft, casting a glow across her skin that made her look ethereal, almost untouchable, as though the trauma of hours ago had only happened in another lifetime. Yet the faint tremble in her lips, the occasional furrow of her brow, and the way her chest rose and fell in quiet conflict betrayed the storm that still raged beneath her silence. Leonard bent forward, placing a kiss on her forehead, not rushed, not just out of comfort, but slow, meaningful, a prayer laced in lips, a vow carried in breath, as his eyes closed for a moment and he whispered with hushed desperation, "I'm here now, my love. I should have never let you go alone." The pilot spoke softly over the intercom, informing them they would land at the estate within 20 minutes. But Leonard barely heard him. His world had shrunk into the dimensions of this woman curled up beside him, the woman who looked like a fallen rose, still fragrant after the fire, the woman who had become more than just his wife. She had become the part of himself he didn't know he needed, until life without her felt like drowning. Her hand shifted, fingers finding his on instinct, and he gripped them like a lifeline, holding them against his heart, rubbing circles on the back of her hand with the pad of his thumb as if trying to soothe a wound neither time nor words could heal. Zariah's eyelids fluttered open slowly, lashes parting like the petals of a reluctant flower at dawn. And the moment her tired eyes found his face, a flicker of disbelief washed through her. Was she dreaming? Was this real? Or was her mind giving her mercy in the form of a hallucination? But when she saw the ache in Leonard's eyes, the fire and sorrow battling for space within that brilliant blue, she knew this wasn't a dream. It was love, broken and desperate and raw, kneeling in front of her in the form of a man who held empires, but was brought to his knees by the sight of her pain. "Leonard," her voice came out in a breathless whisper, cracked but sweet, like wind brushing over scorched earth, and his breath caught as he leaned down again, his forehead pressing softly against hers. "Shh, don't talk yet," he whispered, his voice like velvet dipped in remorse. "You're safe now. I've got you, and I'll never, never let them hurt you again." Her throat tightened, but her hand reached up to gently touch his cheek. her fingers gliding across the faint stubble she had once joked about needing trimming, a memory that now fluttered through her mind like a soft curtain blowing through an open window. As the jet glided through streaks of pink and orange sunset above the clouds, Zariah's mind, despite the exhaustion, drifted backward, her consciousness slipping into memories that came like waves, slow and steady, brushing against her bruised soul with comfort. She saw him for the first time all over again, under the quiet trees of her village, dressed plainly in jeans and a white shirt, hiding behind sunglasses and a baseball cap that failed miserably at concealing his aura of wealth and command. But at the time, she didn't know who he was. She just saw a lost man whose car had broken down and who looked like he hadn't slept in days. She had offered him water, guided him to her uncle's mechanic shop, and without asking for anything, had waited beside him under the shade of an acacia tree, where they shared simple talk, warm laughter, and a silence that somehow wasn't empty. What followed were fleeting visits. He returned again, then again, always under the radar, always in plain clothes. But each time he stayed a little longer. Dinners under the stars where he listened more than he spoke. Walks through moonlit fields where his fingers brushed against hers and lingered. She had no idea he was one of the most powerful men in the business world, a billionaire whose face was often hidden behind tabloid scandals and corporate rumors. To her, he was just Leonard, a man with quiet eyes, a tired smile, and a way of holding silence that made it feel sacred. And when he finally proposed to her, under a midnight sky where fireflies danced like stars come down to earth, he didn't come with diamonds or gold, but with a small ring made of woven grass and a vow that made her heart tremble. I have the world at my feet, but I've never wanted it more than I want you. Will you be my forever, even if the world never knows? Their marriage had been quiet, intimate, blessed by a coastal priest who asked no questions. Leonard had begged her to keep it a secret, not because he was ashamed, but because he feared what the media would do to her once they found out. His world was brutal, full of greed, gossip, betrayal, and vultures who would shred her soul just for a headline. Let me protect you in the shadows until I build a shield strong enough for the light, he had told her, and she, naive, in love and trusting, had agreed. He promised it would be temporary. But weeks turned to months. His calls became less frequent, not because he didn't care, but because he was planning something. A surprise villa on a private island, a new identity for her so she could travel freely. A life of quiet luxury away from everything. And when Zariah grew restless and returned to her village, missing her roots, her people, and the girl she used to be, she never imagined she would be met with violence instead of welcome. Now, lying beside him again, she saw all of it, felt all of it. And the ache wasn't just physical. It was the ache of trust stretched thin, of love tested by separation, of a woman thrown to wolves because she walked alone into the past. Leonard's hand cupped her cheek gently, and when she looked up at him with eyes full of questions and sorrow, he didn't need her to speak. I left for Paris, he whispered, regret lining every word like sharp thread. I wanted to finish the villa, bring you there for your birthday. I wanted to give you something that showed how much you mean to me. I was coming back for you, Zariah. I never thought. His voice cracked, and he closed his eyes, trying to swallow the guilt like acid. I never thought they'd hurt you for loving me. Zariah wiped a tear from his cheek with her thumb, a soft smile touching her lips despite the pain. I'm okay now, she whispered, and the strength in her voice was not loud, but it was whole. It was the voice of a woman who had been through hell and still believed in heaven. Leonard leaned down, pressing his lips to her forehead again, and in that quiet, suspended space above the clouds, something in him shifted. He no longer felt like the billionaire who owned cities. He felt like a man who had almost lost the only person who ever truly saw him. And as the jet began its slow descent toward the private estate nestled in the mountains, where waiting staff had been preparing her favorite flowers, where silk sheets had been turned down, and soft piano music waited in the hallways, Leonard didn't care about the estate, the staff, the millions in the vaults, or the power he held across continents. All he cared about was the woman beside him, his wife, his soul's mirror. And as he held her closer, shielding her as the jet tilted gently into landing, he stared out the window and whispered to the sky, "This world owes her peace, and I will collect every piece of it, even if I have to burn everything in my name to do it." The night had passed like a dream soaked in silence, a night where Leonard had held Zariah in the safety of their bed, with his arms wrapped tightly around her, his body pressed protectively to hers as if proximity could erase pain, as if love poured through skin could replace every cruel word that had ever been thrown her way. And while her breathing slowly calmed into sleep, while her eyes rested and her body relaxed into the silk sheets beneath her, Leonard lay wide awake, his mind ablaze with a rage so cold it was surgical, so focused it became a storm waiting to be unleashed with precision. Because if the world thought it could tear down the woman he loved, they hadn't yet seen the full fury of a man whose entire empire had been built from steel, fire, and an unforgiving will. And so, as the first traces of morning light filtered through the tall glass windows of the mansion, Leonard rose from the bed without a sound, kissed Zariah's temple one last time, and stepped into the black suit that fit him like armor. By the time the sun had climbed above the hills, he was already inside his high-security office at the far end of the estate, a room encased in bulletproof glass, lined with silent servers and screens displaying market charts, encrypted files, and international holdings, where every keystroke could alter the fate of nations if he so desired. And today he would use this fortress of wealth not to expand his reach, but to crush the small, pitiful world that dared to lay hands on the woman who meant everything to him. He canceled meetings scheduled with investors from Zurich, postponed negotiations with oil ministers in Abu Dhabi, ignored a call from the UN Advisory Board where he was supposed to deliver a keynote, and instead summoned his private counsel, his forensic team, his cyber intelligence officers, and the chief analyst who tracked offshore accounts. "I want the mayor's full financial history within the last 10 years, Leonard growled as he paced across the room, his fists clenched, his jaw set like granite. Every deposit, every foreign transfer, every shadow donation from companies that don't exist. I want to know where his wife shops, where his children go to school, and what brands of cigarettes he hides in his drawer. Bring me every dirty thread, and bring it now." His voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the silence like a scalpel, and within moments the room buzzed to life as files appeared across glowing monitors, documents flashing open, and accounts unraveling like a quilt of corruption. The mayor's name was linked to shell companies in the Caymans, luxury condos in Nairobi, and a hidden stash of assets transferred under the name of a distant cousin who happened to own 3 empty warehouses in the capital. Within 2 hours, Leonard had all of it in front of him, and by the third hour he had contacted 3 global banks, freezing transactions from every account tied to those names through discreet partnerships he had forged years ago. His lawyer sent disguised inquiries, his team triggered tax alerts that would trigger internal audits, and Leonard sat back in his chair, watching as a man who once stood tall in a dusty village now began to sink under the invisible weight of digital justice. But he didn't stop there. He instructed his wealth management firm to quietly buy out every outstanding loan, lien, or property mortgage owed by anyone in that village, especially those who had raised voices, thrown stones, or smeared Zariah's name. "Use a dummy holding. Make it look like a development investment group," he told his assistant coldly. "And when the payments come due, tighten the terms. They'll feel the squeeze. No blood, no court, just pressure." There was no satisfaction in his eyes, only precision, cold and impersonal. This wasn't revenge for the sake of ego. It was war for the sake of love. The village had tried to break her spirit. Now Leonard would break their comfort, legally, quietly, and completely. The final blow came when he sent anonymous letters to village families offering employment programs, education funds, and farm subsidies, but only for women and children, with clauses that bypassed the village council and mayor altogether. He was rebuilding what they tried to destroy, but in doing so he made sure that power would never again sit in the hands of those who abused it. When it was done, Leonard stood in his office, staring at the digital trail of operations he had executed, and whispered under his breath like a soldier whispering to the battlefield, "You don't hurt what I love." Not without remembering it for the rest of your lives. Back at the mansion, Zariah sat alone in the eastern sunroom, wrapped in a soft white silk robe that fell across her skin like whispered forgiveness. Her hair gently brushed and tied in a loose braid that Leonard had done for her before leaving the room. He had stood behind her with a comb in hand, threading through each strand with care, asking nothing, demanding nothing, just being present with a love. So still it brought tears to her eyes. Now she sat curled in the cushioned window seat, knees drawn up beneath her, the breeze filtering through sheer curtains like the sigh of a world trying to apologize for yesterday. And outside, birds danced between lemon trees and orange blossoms that filled the garden with color and fragrance. But Zariah wasn't watching the birds. Her gaze was somewhere else, far beyond the roses, beyond the tall hedges, beyond the estate walls, her mind replaying the faces that spat on her, the mocking voices, the cold spit against her cheek, the moment she nearly lost the part of herself that still believed in kindness. And yet, as tears slid down her cheeks, she made no sound. Her sorrow had become a river that ran in silence, carving new places inside her heart where dignity and pain lived together like reluctant sisters. She didn't want to talk. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted stillness, healing, breath. And somewhere deep inside her, a question. Was she still the same Zariah who smiled at strangers and forgave quickly, or had something changed forever? When Leonard finally returned just before dusk, the light casting long golden shadows across the marble floors, he found her still in the sunroom, still watching the same spot in the garden, as though waiting for something to bloom inside her. He said nothing at first, just walked toward her slowly, loosening his tie and sinking down beside her, resting his head in her lap like a soldier returning from battle. Not triumphant, not boastful, but exhausted, broken, and ashamed. Zariah looked down at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his eyes, and her fingers moved instinctively to his hair, threading through it with slow, tender strokes that said more than any words could. "I failed to protect you," he murmured, his voice low, heavy, as if the confession cost him pieces of his soul. "I should have been there. I should have seen this coming. I thought the world would leave you in peace if I hid you in love." Zariah bent forward and kissed his forehead gently, her lips lingering there, her voice soft as a lullaby. "You didn't fail," she whispered. "You came for me. When no one else did, you came." And in those words, Leonard found a forgiveness he hadn't earned, a redemption that only love could give. He closed his eyes, letting her fingers soothe the war in his heart, and promised silently to himself that whatever it took, money, power, years of his life, he would build her a world so safe, so gentle, that her scars would one day forget why they ever bled. That night, as the moon rose like a guardian over the mountains and the stars blinked softly in their velvet sky, Leonard and Zariah lay tangled in each other under the satin canopy of their bed, not seeking passion but presence, not touching out of desire but out of need. A touch that said, "I'm here, I'm breathing because of you." He held her tightly, his arms wrapped around her like chains made of devotion, his breath warm against the curve of her neck. And in the hush between midnight and morning, Leonard made a vow in his heart, a vow not spoken, not written, but felt like an oath between blood and stars, that no one, not kings or countries, not journalists or ghosts, not even time itself, would ever touch her soul again. And if they dared, they would not live to tell the tale. The moonlight filtered softly through the silk curtains of the mansion's eastern windows, its silver glow bathing the marble floors in silence. And in that delicate hour where sleep clung to the walls, but love refused to close its eyes, Leonard lay awake beside Zariah, watching her breathe, her cheek resting peacefully against his chest, her fingers still curled gently against his heart, as if claiming her place not just in the bed, but inside his soul. And as the weight of his earlier vow settled deeper into his bones, that no harm would ever touch her again, he rose carefully, wrapping her in the duvet, and kissed her temple with reverence before stepping into the hallway, lit by soft golden sconces and the scent of gardenias carried from the terrace below. But this time he wasn't walking toward war or vengeance. He was walking toward beauty, toward the gift she didn't yet know waited for her. A surprise born not out of guilt, but adoration. Something he'd spent months building quietly behind her back, drawing from every whispered dream she'd ever let slip in the quiet hours of their hidden marriage. When she spoke of wide-open skies, of books she loved, of paintings that made her weep, of a home where every corner felt like a poem written just for her. And now that vision stood ready. So when morning rose and birds sang through the orchard, he returned to the bedroom, knelt beside the bed, and gently coaxed her awake. Not with urgency, but with the softest smile and the tender brushing of his lips against her knuckles. "Get dressed, love," he whispered. "I have something to show you." Zariah, still stretching the sleep from her limbs, blinked up at him with curiosity, trusting the warmth in his gaze even before knowing where they were going. He helped her into a soft blue sundress, tied a silk ribbon in her hair, and held her hand as they stepped into the elevator that took them down through the west wing of the estate, past doors she had never opened. And when those final wide oak doors swung open to reveal the new world he had made for her, Zariah gasped, not from shock, but from something deeper, almost sacred. Before her stood a second mansion within the estate, wrapped in flowering vines and facing the endless blue of the ocean. Its architecture was soft and modern, with white stone pillars, curved balconies, glass walls reflecting the waves below, and gardens shaped like the pages of her favorite. Books inside, every room whispered her name. The grand sunroom where orchids in every shade surrounded shelves filled with her beloved novels. A painting gallery where portraits of nameless women rising from flames hung like goddesses reborn. A music room filled with silence waiting to be broken by joy. There were cozy corners lined with throw pillows in earth tones, a kitchen stocked with the teas she once brewed for him on rainy days, and a balcony that caught the sunrise at exactly the hour she liked to read. And at the center of it all, carved above the fireplace in golden letters, was a single line from the poem she once told him reminded her of home. "Even ashes dream of wings." Tears welled in her eyes, not because it was grand, but because it was her. He had seen her, truly seen her, in every cracked place, and chosen not to fix her, but to honor her. "This is yours," Leonard said, stepping behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and kissing the side of her neck as she trembled. "Every inch of it, every breath of it. I built this not for you to escape, but for you to bloom." Zariah turned in his arms, burying her face in his chest, the sobs quiet but full, and he held her as the waves kissed the cliffs behind them, as the sea wind wrapped around their silhouettes and sealed the promise between them in salt and sunlight. From that day forward, the healing began not just in words, but in laughter. It started small, A smile during breakfast, a shared look in the hallway, her giggle when he tickled her in the rose garden. She began humming again while watering her plants, reading aloud to herself in the library, dancing barefoot on the terrace when the breeze played her favorite melodies. She wore colors again: yellow, coral, plum. And Leonard, once a man who ruled meetings with silence and gazes colder than winter steel, now found himself waiting at doorways just to catch the sound of her voice, sneaking into the kitchen just to steal kisses while she stirred tea, and lying beside her for hours not saying a word, because silence in her presence no longer felt lonely. It felt like peace. Their days became a rhythm of joy born from pain. Long walks through the orange blossom path, where she pressed her palm against his chest and listened to the beat of the man behind the suit. Lazy afternoons spent feeding doves, where her hands found his as naturally as breath. Quiet dinners under the golden vines, where wine glasses clicked in soft toasts, and Leonard watched her every move like a man memorizing salvation. And when night fell, their bodies spoke in ways no language ever could. Under silk sheets and dimmed chandeliers, Leonard worshipped her with a devotion that left her gasping, not in pleasure alone, but in awe, in the sacredness of being seen, desired, and cherished in ways no bruise could ever undo. His hands were reverent, slow, purposeful, and her skin welcomed him like a sea welcomes rain. In those moments, she wasn't the girl tied to a post. She was the woman his soul knelt before, and each time he whispered her name in the hush between their kisses, it sounded like a prayer. One night, as candles flickered on the edge of the bath, and the world outside their gates felt like a distant universe, she looked at him and finally asked the question that had haunted her heart since the beginning. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice vulnerable, as her fingers ran through the water between them. He leaned in, cupped her face in both hands, and answered not with flattery, not with poetry, but with raw, honest truth. "Because you see the broken in people, and still choose to love them whole. You looked at me and didn't see power. You saw pain, and you stayed." That night, as rain tapped gently on the glass and thunder rolled somewhere far off like a sleepy lion, they made love not as two people escaping their pasts, but as two souls returning home. It wasn't frantic, it wasn't loud. It was deep, slow, consuming, a communion of hearts that had suffered, survived, and now healed in each other's arms. And in the quiet afterward, when her head lay on his chest and his arms circled her with the ease of instinct, Zariah felt something bloom inside her, not just trust, not just hope, but a profound peace that whispered, "You're exactly where you're meant to be." Outside their window, the world slept, but in the shadows of the mansion, love had found light, still far beyond the cliffs and calm, in the realm they could not yet see. Old enemies stirred in silence, and the echoes of power began to shake again. The wind that swept along the ocean cliffs that morning carried a strange stillness with it, a stillness Zariah couldn't explain, but felt in her bones as she stood on the balcony wrapped in a lavender shawl, sipping tea and watching the waves crash like thunder rolling softly against stone. And though her heart was learning how to smile again, and the mansion around her had become a temple of peace, something beneath the calm whispered that the shadows they had left behind were not yet done with them. She didn't know that far across continents, in a luxury penthouse wrapped in glass and anger, a woman scrolled through social media headlines with eyes sharp as razors and a jaw so tight it trembled. Dahlia Monroe, the once chosen darling of the media, heiress to an international fashion dynasty and former fiancé of Leonard Drake, watched each headline flash with Zariah's name and face and grace, and every click of her manicured finger fed her fury like kerosene fed fire. Zariah Bloom, from village girl to the billionaire's hidden bride, inside the private love story that shook the fashion world, Leonard Drake's mysterious mansion bride finally revealed. Every caption, every photo of Zariah wrapped in elegance, beside the man Dahlia once called hers, felt like acid down her throat, and as her polished nails dug into her champagne glass until it cracked slightly under pressure, her mind spun not with heartbreak, but with humiliation, the kind that power-hungry people feel when the world moves on without them. To Dahlia, it wasn't about love. It was about control and the loss of it. She had worn Leonard on red carpets like a prize, smiled at cameras with practiced perfection, and schemed to turn their engagement into a brand empire. And yet he had vanished one season and emerged the next, not with a ring on her finger, but with a wife no one had seen coming, especially not her. Unable to bear it another second, Dahlia packed her jet-black designer suitcase, boarded her private jet with cold fire in her eyes, and flew straight into the dirt she thought she could shape. Back to the village where Leonard's wife had been born, bruised and nearly buried under shame, unaware that she was returning to the same soil now soaked in silence after Leonard's quiet vengeance. There, Dahlia met with the one man who still hated Leonard Drake enough to partner with her, the village mayor. Bitter, humiliated, and newly crushed under frozen assets and looming audits, he welcomed Dahlia with a half-hearted smile and a deeper, more dangerous desire to strike back. Over dark tea and sharper intentions, Dahlia whispered poison into his ear. "He used her," she said, eyes gleaming. "She's not his bride. She's his puppet. You think someone like him marries someone like her because of love?" The mayor, wounded and cornered, nodded slowly, already imagining the fire they could light together, an image campaign against Zariah, carefully fed through whispers and social pages, community groups, and hushed church corners, designed to undo everything Leonard had built for her. Dahlia, ever the strategist, commissioned anonymous blogs, gossip columns, and fake testimonials claiming Zariah seduced Leonard for money, played victim, manipulated a man who was vulnerable. "The world eats drama," she sneered. "We'll give them a banquet." Back at the mansion, Zariah remained blissfully unaware of the storm curling at the edges of her peace. Her days were still painted with healing, reading poetry in the solarium, sketching in the gardens, brushing her fingers over piano keys like rediscovering an old friend. Leonard had been a little quieter lately, a little more watchful, his phone calls longer, his voice sharper when speaking to someone named Ronan behind closed doors. But he didn't bring it to her. He let her rest, believing she had earned at least a few months of light before darkness knocked again. Still, Zariah, ever intuitive, felt it. The small shift in the air, like the scent before a storm. The wind didn't move the same. The birds were quieter. Her own spirit had become alert, bracing, though she didn't know why. Then one morning, as she wandered into the rose room with bare feet and humming a song she used to hear in childhood, she noticed something on the writing table. A plain envelope, no return address, her name scrawled in sharp ink across its center. Inside, her fingers found a printed page with no signature, just 5 words. "You don't belong with him." And beneath it, another line. "You'll never be one of us." Her hands trembled slightly, her pulse quickened, and though her face remained calm, her heart felt the echo of that old village square. Taunts, shame, ropes, and bruises, all waking from slumber. When Leonard returned that afternoon, carrying a bouquet of moon-white lilies he'd had flown in from Florence, he found her standing by the fireplace, her back straight, her hand clutching the note like it was the last piece of her innocence. She said nothing. She just handed it to him, and the moment his eyes scanned the words, his face darkened, not with confusion but with recognition. He knew the tactics. He recognized the venom. "Dahlia," he muttered under his breath, voice dry as winter ash. She didn't ask who that was. She only looked into his eyes and said softly, It's starting again, isn't it? Leonard crumpled the note in his fist, the paper crunching beneath fingers so tight they turned white, and for a moment he looked like a man who had just watched the world take another swing at his heart. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, deadly, and absolute. "Enough," he said. "They've taken enough pieces of you. Now, it's time they see who you really are." And with that he kissed her hand, long, slow, as if charging it with his power, and walked to the secure wing of the mansion, where encrypted servers, surveillance files, and private dossiers lived behind fingerprint-locked doors. He called Ronan, called the London office, unleashed a full team of private investigators, cyber sleuths, and legal eagles, all with one target: Dahlia Monroe's empire. He wasn't out for scandal. He was out for truth, for exposure. He would not destroy her with lies. He would dismantle her with facts. Tax fraud, blackmail, bribery of journalists, secret payoffs to social influencers, misappropriated charity funds she used for luxury fashion lines. Every stone she'd used to build her throne, Leonard would now pull out from beneath her feet, one by one, until she stood naked before the world, not out of cruelty, but because no one who tried to rewrite Zariah's story with venom would be allowed to walk freely through this world again. She chose darkness, Leonard told his team. Now let her be judged by the light. Meanwhile, he returned to Zariah's side each evening without showing her the rage he carried through the day. He fed her joy, laughter, reassurance, but inside he moved like a shadow across borders, a silent weapon being drawn. And Zariah, though she didn't yet know the full extent of what Dahlia had planned or how the village whispers had begun again in online corners, felt her spine straighten with each breath. She refused to crumble, refused to break. Whatever storm was coming, she would walk through it as the woman Leonard had built this life for, not because he saved her, but because she had saved herself long before he came. And now, she wasn't alone anymore. The dawn broke gently over the sea, casting golden fingers across the marble floors of the mansion. But inside the bedroom, it wasn't the sunrise that stirred Zariah. It was purpose. After days of silence, of watching Leonard move like a silent warrior, protecting her from the chaos Dahlia tried to ignite, after watching headlines rise and fade, she had made a decision not in haste, but in the quiet breath of dawns spent staring out at the water, asking herself what legacy she wanted to leave behind, not just for herself, but for every girl still silenced, still doubted, still waiting to believe she was worthy of more. And so, as Leonard slept beside her, the strength in his arms still wrapped around her like armor. She kissed his forehead, rose without sound, and stepped into her dressing room where a team of stylists waited, already briefed by her in secret. She chose not the soft pastel gowns Leonard adored, not the sweeping floral dresses she often wore in the gardens, but white silk, pure as ash reborn, and heels the color of burning gold. Her hair was swept into a crown of braids, not high or boastful, but elegant, commanding, and her lips were painted with rose and resolve. She didn't want to walk back into that village to retaliate. She wanted to rewrite the very meaning of what they once tried to do to her. She wasn't going back to settle scores. She was going back to shift history. Leonard woke to find a letter on his nightstand, not long, not poetic, just a single sentence in Zariah's steady handwriting. "I'm going home today, not to remember pain, but to plant something new." He read the note twice, then reached for his phone and called his head of security. "Follow her," he instructed, his voice calm but tight. "Protect her, but don't interfere. This is her battle now." Then he stood by the window, hands in the pockets of his robe, watching her car disappear down the winding road toward the past she was finally ready to face. Hours later, the village square stood still in disbelief. The same dusty plaza where they once mocked, spit, tied and humiliated her, was now lined with white security SUVs, black-suited guards, camera crews, and media vans that had heard whispers of an anonymous press invitation sent the night before. Locals peered from windows, frozen in place as the hum of conversation thickened with tension and guilt. And then she arrived. The car doors opened and out stepped Zariah Bloom, no longer the barefoot girl in rags, no longer the bruised scapegoat of their gossip, but a woman wrapped in elegance and silence, each step of her golden heels echoing across cobblestone like thunder, muffled by grace. Her chin was high but not haughty, her posture regal but not arrogant. Her silence screamed louder than any speech could have, and behind her walked journalists clutching cameras, women in headscarves, girls in school uniforms holding flowers. The world had come to watch her rise, and the village had no choice but to witness it. Without a word, she walked to the exact post they once tied her to, now cleaned and wrapped in ceremonial cloth, and stood before it like a statue returned to its pedestal. Microphones lined the makeshift podium nearby. Her security flanked the square's entrance but kept their distance. A hush fell over the village like the eye of a storm had settled over their sins. And Zariah stepped forward. "I am not here to punish," she said, her voice soft but impossibly clear, like silk being cut by light. "I am not here for revenge, because revenge is for those who believe pain must be passed on. I believe pain must be broken, right here, where it once tried to break me." Murmurs began, but she didn't flinch. "I've returned to build, to offer the one thing that was denied me when I was a girl in this square, dignity." Then she turned slightly, signaling her team, and a banner was unfurled behind her with two simple words: the Bloom Foundation. The announcement came like lightning. "With the help of partners and my husband's philanthropic branch, I will be funding the construction of the village's first women's center, built here in the heart of this square. It will provide education, shelter, skill training, and medical support for girls and women, abandoned, silenced, or abused. No questions asked, no shame attached. We are also launching a scholarship program that will send village girls to universities abroad, because your worth is not defined by borders or birth." She paused then, and for the first time her smile faltered, not from fear but from emotion. "You tied me here to destroy me," she whispered, her hand gently touching the post. "But you taught me something even your cruelty didn't intend. You taught me what kind of woman I never want to become." And with that, she stepped away, not waiting for applause, not asking for forgiveness. But it came anyway. Women in the crowd began to weep openly. A teacher dropped to her knees. A girl approached shyly and handed her a letter. Even the mayor, his once defiant face pale and tight, stood speechless behind a curtain of shame. Zariah didn't look at him. She had already moved past what he could never undo. The cameras captured her from every angle, not as a victim, but as a vision. She didn't need to shout. She didn't raise a single hand. And yet, every soul in that village felt shaken, changed, reborn in her silence. That evening, as the sun set behind the newly cleared lot where builders had already begun marking land for the women's center, Zariah stepped back into her car and quietly instructed the driver to return home. She didn't ask for validation. She didn't care if they truly understood. What mattered was what had been planted. The seed of change, of dignity, of hope that could no longer be erased. Leonard was waiting on the marble steps of the mansion when her car pulled in, his tie loosened, his hands tucked in his pockets. But the moment she stepped out, his composure broke just a little. He rushed toward her, gathered her into his arms, and held her so tightly she melted into him without hesitation. "I watched it all," he whispered against her hair. "I saw what you did." She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his. Did I do enough? He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her forehead like a priest blessing a queen. You did what I never could, he said. You burned down hate without using fire. And as they walked back into the mansion, her fingers entwined in his, he paused before the door and looked at her with the kind of pride that held weight in his bones. You are strength without shouting, he said. You always have been. And this time Zariah didn't just smile, she believed it. The morning after her return from the village, Zariah stood by the window of the east corridor, the long sheer curtains flowing around her like waves of memory. The scent of wild roses from the cliffside gardens drifting into the room, and her fingers clutched a small silver plaque, cool to the touch, heavy in meaning. The sun had not fully risen yet, but she was already dressed in ivory linen, her hair swept back into a soft braid that revealed the elegant lines of her jaw, her shoulders bare as if to say, I am no longer hiding. Leonard stirred behind her, still tangled in the linen sheets, but he didn't speak. He only watched her from the bed as she traced the edge of the plaque again and again, her eyes not distant but deeply centered. She had not slept much, but she didn't need to. There was no heaviness today. There was only clarity. Today she would return one last time, not to teach, not to announce, not to rebuild, but to reclaim. To lay a stone where pain once stood. To leave a marker, not of revenge, but of remembrance. She whispered the words engraved on the plaque, as if tasting them for the first time. Zariah Bloom Drake, the woman they tried to break. She closed her eyes and exhaled. Not broke, she whispered to herself, but born again. Leonard rose slowly, wrapping an arm around her from behind and kissing her temple. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice low. She shook her head. I already did the hard part. This is for the girls who'll come after me. Later that morning, as the sky softened to a dreamy blue, the village square once again began to fill, but this time there were no ropes, no chants, no rotten fruit hidden behind bitter palms. There were flower petals on the ground, schoolgirls with notebooks in their hands, and women standing tall beside their daughters. Journalists returned too, but none of them carried questions filled with malice, only awe. A small platform had been built by Zariah's team overnight, and a single brass post stood in the center of the square where once a wooden one had loomed. This one was elegant, curved, and quiet, but unmistakably in the same place. And at its base was a polished marble slab waiting to hold the plaque Zariah now carried close to her chest. As she stepped from the sleek car and walked across the square, every whisper stilled, every glance lowered, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Her white dress glowed in the morning light, and her gold earrings caught the sun like small flames. She reached the post, placed the plaque gently in its hollow, and stepped back to face the village. Not on a stage, not behind a podium, but right in the center of the earth that once swallowed her pride. I'm not here to erase what happened, she began, her voice steady, her chin high. Because what happened was real. You tied me here. A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd, but she raised her hand gently to keep them from speaking. You tied me here and called me worthless. You let the dirt swallow my name. You let silence cover my truth. But I stand here today, not as your victim, and not even as your survivor. I stand as a witness. That cruelty is not stronger than compassion. That shame does not outlive grace. That silence is not weakness. Because while you judged my quiet, you didn't know I was protecting something sacred. Her eyes scanned the faces before her, and for a long moment they rested on her stepmother. Now older, her beauty wilted by time, her scarf clutched to her face as tears streaked her cheeks freely. I forgive you, Zariah said softly, her voice so quiet it made everyone lean closer. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. A gasp echoed somewhere from the edge of the crowd. Her stepmother dropped to her knees, overcome by something neither guilt nor regret could fully name, and Zariah turned away, not in rejection but release. She had let it go, and she had risen from it. Leonard stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, not as the billionaire, not as the man of power, but as her partner, her witness, her anchor, and stood beside her silently. He didn't speak. He didn't raise a hand or pull focus. He simply looked at her the way only a man who had seen someone rebuild their soul from ashes could. And in that silence the crowd found something more powerful than speeches. They saw union. They saw dignity reborn. Mothers began to weep. Fathers lowered their hats. Boys who once mocked now stared with shame. Girls pressed their hands over their hearts, and as the village bell rang noon in the distance, the sun cast its full light on the plaque at the base of the post, illuminating every word. Zariah Bloom Drake, the woman they tried to break. Her name, once dragged through dust, now carved in honor, now touched with reverence, now eternal in the place they once hoped she would disappear. As people slowly approached one by one, not with accusations but with quiet apologies, Zariah didn't hold on to pride. She hugged a teacher who once looked away. She nodded at a market woman who had spread cruel stories. She even smiled at a group of teen girls who whispered, "She's so brave," behind trembling fingers. The entire square became a place not of confrontation, but transformation. No guards, no barricades, just truth. Zariah had not only reclaimed her story, she had rewritten the story of the entire village. They would now be known not just as the place where she was broken, but the place where she rose. And the symbol she left behind, the plaque, the center, the foundation, would remain as a seed blooming forever beyond her footsteps. That evening, back at the mansion, Zariah and Leonard sat on the edge of the infinity pool, their bare feet dangling just above the water's surface as pink and orange painted the sky. He poured her tea instead of champagne because he knew today wasn't about celebration. It was about cleansing. They didn't talk much. She laid her head on his shoulder, and he ran his fingers along her arm in slow, thoughtful lines. But before the stars arrived, Leonard turned to her and spoke gently. "You didn't just rise today, Zariah. You lifted them with you." She smiled, tired but full, and replied, "If even one girl stands taller because of what I did, then everything was worth it." He nodded, pulling her closer. And in that golden hush between the end of one chapter and the beginning of the next, Zariah finally felt something she hadn't in years: wholeness. As the stars scattered across the velvet sky like tiny burning promises, and the last glow of sunset dipped beneath the curve of the ocean, Zariah lay nestled against Leonard's chest on the chaise beside the pool, the soft rustle of the breeze combing through her curls, her hand resting over his heartbeat, while the gentle silence between them carried more depth than 1,000 words. The day had been heavy yet sacred, transformative in ways neither of them had fully processed, and though her body was exhausted from the intensity of emotions, her spirit hummed with quiet fire. Leonard shifted slightly, kissed the crown of her head, and whispered, "Get dressed, love. We're not done yet." Zariah turned to him slowly, brow furrowing in curiosity, her lips parting to question, but he stopped her with a smile that held both mischief and meaning, and gently pulled her to her feet. She followed him into their walk-in dressing suite where, to her surprise, her favorite stylist and a tailor stood waiting with a custom evening gown in hand, midnight black satin cascading into gold-embroidered wings at the hem, paired with heels studded in tiny emerald stones that sparkled like stars. "Leonard, what is this?" she asked, eyes wide. He leaned in, brushed a loose strand behind her ear, and said only, "A promise I still owe you." She changed slowly, aware of every thread on her skin, every shimmer that caught the light. When she turned to face him fully dressed, Leonard, now in a sleek obsidian tuxedo, nearly forgot how to breathe. He held out his hand. "Let me take you somewhere." Outside, the night wind carried warmth as a soft hum filled the air, the deep, smooth purr of rotors overhead. Zariah followed Leonard up the private hill where the helicopter waited, not the usual Black Fleet vehicle, but a diamond-studded, custom-made beauty reflecting the moonlight like a celestial ship. Its silver body had her initials engraved near the door, ZBD. She gasped, "Is this?" He smiled. "It's ours." And with that, they lifted into the night sky, the village a soft glow beneath them, distant enough to feel like a memory, but near enough to matter. As they flew over cliffs and fields bathed in starlight, Zariah leaned into him, her hand in his, but still unsure of what this flight meant, until the chopper tilted low and circled once, and she saw it. The village square, lit with thousands of warm fairy lights, the entire plaza transformed into a floral wonderland, music playing softly from unseen speakers, and people, so many people, standing in gentle silence around the same post that now bore her plaque. Zariah's breath caught in her throat. The pilot descended slowly. Leonard held her gaze the entire time, his eyes burning with something ancient and new. The moment the chopper touched down, he helped her out, and they walked hand in hand across the petal-lined path, the entire village parting like a tide of awe, not in shame, but in wonder. And then, in the very place that had once become her crucifixion, Leonard turned to her, still holding her hand, then dropped slowly, deliberately, to one knee, his tuxedo brushing the cobblestones, his expression raw and trembling. For a heartbeat the world stilled, no wind, no whisper, no breath, only his voice, low, steady, soaked in reverence. "Zariah Bloom," he said, "the woman who taught me that silence can roar, that grace is the strongest armor, that love is not possession but protection. Will you marry me again? This time not in secret, not in shadows, not hidden from the world, but here before the people who saw your fall and must now witness your rising. Will you say yes to me again, not because I deserve you, but because you've always been the only thing I've ever truly wanted?" Zariah stood frozen, tears already burning down. Her cheeks, her lips quivering as she reached out, pulled him gently up from his knees, cupped his face in her palms, and whispered with a sob between her teeth, "Yes, yes, Leonard. 1,000 times yes." The village erupted, not with chaos, but with cheers, genuine and alive. Elder women clapped with wet eyes, children threw petals into the air. Even Zariah's former enemies stood and applauded, their hands moving slowly at first, then growing louder, fuller, as if their palms had finally understood truth. And then Leonard pulled a ring from his inner coat pocket. Not just any ring, but a custom-cut emerald shaped like a phoenix mid-flight, its wings flaring in gold, its eye a tiny diamond set deep in its core. He slipped it onto her finger, his hands shaking with emotion, and kissed her palm with reverence. "A phoenix," he said, "because you didn't rise from ashes. You created your own sky." Zariah couldn't hold back anymore. She pulled him into her arms and they kissed. Slow, unhurried, a kiss that didn't perform but testified. A kiss that said, "We survived." A kiss that said, "This is not a fairy tale, it's faith." And as their lips met under the stars, surrounded by a crowd that once tried to erase her, the square was baptized anew, not in humiliation, but in honor. The ground beneath her feet, once laced with fear, now felt sacred. As they stood hand in hand, their silhouettes bathed in silver light, Leonard turned to her and whispered, "Tonight, we didn't just win. We healed." She nodded through her tears, and for the first time she didn't just feel strong. She felt seen. Zariah Bloom Drake had been many things: a village girl, a victim, a wife, a warrior. But tonight, she became a legacy. And this time, the world would remember her not for what she survived, but for how she soared. The morning after Leonard's second proposal lingered like a dream, but there was no dream in the way Zariah stood at her dressing mirror as the first light of dawn crept through the mansion's balcony, its golden beams kissing her skin, illuminating the gentle curve of her cheek as stylists moved quietly around her hair brushing silk across her frame, adjusting folds and curling strands of her hair into a crown braided with ivory ribbon and shimmering threads of gold. She did not speak much, she didn't need to, for today her silence was not born of sorrow, but of grace, of knowing that this day was not just hers, but belonged to every girl who had ever been told she was unworthy, every woman who had ever been doubted, every soul that had ever been shamed for daring to dream above their birth. Today she would walk not just as a bride, but as a rebirth in satin and strength. Leonard had not let her see the venue yet. He wanted it to be a surprise, and so when the car pulled up to the village square, now fully transformed, and the doors opened to reveal a wonderland unlike anything she'd imagined, Zariah covered her mouth with her hand, eyes wide and misted. The air, stolen from her lungs by beauty not because of grandeur, but because of meaning. The same place that once held ropes and ridicule now bloomed with thousands of white roses, climbing the facades of old stone buildings, their petals glistening under gentle morning mist. Gold lanterns floated above like captured stars, and violinists in flowing white garments played soft melodies beneath olive trees wrapped in silk. The old square had been covered in fine golden sand, imported just for her walk down the aisle, giving the earth beneath her feet not just elegance, but softness, a gentle rewriting of what once burned. The rows of guests, dignitaries, family, villagers, strangers, sat in stunned silence, watching a woman who had once stood in chains now return in a gown that whispered freedom with every step. Leonard stood at the altar already, tall, regal, a vision of devotion in a fitted ivory suit with gold embroidery at the collar and cuffs, his hands folded, but his eyes completely consumed by her. He did not look to the guests, nor the flowers, nor the press who had gathered to witness this historical ceremony. His gaze never left Zariah, and as she walked slowly down the aisle, her dress trailing behind her like moonlight woven into fabric, her veil long and flowing like a spirit descending from the sky, every step felt like time itself was folding back, letting her rewrite history with elegance, grace, and immeasurable power. At the front row, even her stepmother clutched a handkerchief, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, not of guilt alone, but of disbelief at what her cruelty had tried to bury and what had risen instead. The violins quieted, the wind hushed. Zariah reached Leonard, and he took her hand, not like a man claiming, but like a man honoring. They turned to face each other, and the officiant stepped back slightly, sensing this moment needed no interjection. Leonard held both her hands and began his vows, voice trembling not with fear, but with the gravity of truth. "Zariah," he said, his voice catching as he looked into her eyes, "you gave me a soul when I only had a name. You taught me that wealth without purpose is silence, and power without love is empty. Before you, I was admired, but with you, I am alive." The guests gasped softly. Someone wept openly. Leonard paused, kissing her knuckles before continuing. "You did not just love me. You made me worthy of love, and I vow for every breath I take after this one to protect your fire, to serve your dreams, and to build a world where no woman ever forgets how sacred she is." Tears rolled down Zariah's cheeks, but she didn't wipe them. She let them fall like pearls down satin. Then she spoke, and even the wind seemed to listen. "Leonard," she said, her voice gentle yet unshakable, You gave me wings when I had only wounds. You saw past the mud on my feet and saw the stars in my spirit. When the world tied me down, you didn't just cut the ropes, you gave me the strength to fly. I vow for every sunrise we wake to together, to be your peace, your mirror, and your home. They exchanged rings then, not symbols of possession but of liberation. Her ring, an emerald phoenix, radiant and proud. His, a thin band inscribed with the coordinates of the village square, marking not where their love began, but where it transformed. As the officiant pronounced them, the crowd didn't erupt in applause. It rose to its feet in reverent silence, then slowly began clapping, not out of ceremony, but from awe. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a revolution wrapped in silk and vows. The reception spilled across the square as the sun dipped and twilight glowed, with candlelit tables draped in gold, platters of delicacies prepared by chefs flown in from every country they had visited during their secret early days of marriage. Leonard surprised her with a live orchestra that played the same instrumental tune she had hummed in their garden weeks ago, turning her private song into a hymn of celebration. Guests mingled, laughed, wept, and danced, not in pretense but in catharsis. Her stepmother, timid yet broken open, approached Zariah with trembling arms and for the first time asked nothing, only offered an embrace. Zariah allowed it, her eyes soft with empathy, not as a daughter forgiving a mother, but as a woman rising above what tried to chain her. The night bloomed into celebration, with fireworks painting the sky in arcs of gold and emerald, each explosion reflected in the fountain now restored at the center of the square. Leonard and Zariah danced beneath it, their bodies pressed close, their hearts in sync, the music wrapping around them like a spell. They didn't need to speak. Every step said we made it. Every spin whispered we are new, and every touch promised we are forever. The stars stretched long and bright across the night sky, and the village, once etched with the darkness of shame, was now a canvas of joy, of possibility, of remembrance, rewritten with love. That night, as lanterns floated upward like blessings being sent to the heavens, Zariah and Leonard stood at the center of the village that once tried to destroy them. Not as victims, not even just as lovers, but as living proof that the ugliest places in our past can still grow gardens if watered with truth. And with every laugh that echoed through the alleys, with every cheer that filled the space where silence once ruled, a single truth emerged, beating louder than any drum or vow. Love, when protected, when believed in, when held even through fire, can turn ruin into roses and ashes into altars. The stars above the village had changed over the years, but the warmth that radiated from the heart of its square, now a sanctuary of learning, laughter, and legacy, remained untouched by time. The once cold cobblestones had long been replaced by smooth golden pathways that led not to judgment, but to possibility, and at the very center stood a gleaming white and gold building with stained glass windows that shimmered with sunlight and told a story in light, the story of Zariah Bloom Drake. It was no longer just the village women's center. It was the House of Bloom, a haven now visited by women from every region, a place that held libraries filled with healing literature, studios for crafts, rooms for legal support, dormitories for young girls fleeing from broken homes, and a courtyard where petals rained down each morning in silent thanks to the woman who had once been tied and humiliated in that very soil. Zariah walked the halls of that center every morning, with grace in her steps and memory in her bones, her presence soft yet commanding, dressed not in royalty's garments but in loose flowing linen, her hair tied in the same braid she wore the day of her return. She greeted the girls with open arms, remembering every name and whispering words they had never heard from their mothers. You are not a burden. You are a beginning. Across from her center, just beyond the magnolia trees, stood a glass and stone campus with ivy crawling up its columns, the Drake Institute for Girls in Tech, a passion project Leonard had built in her honor. And every time she looked across the lawn and saw the hologram lab lit up by girls, coding, designing, dreaming in digital languages, she would smile in silent pride and think, this is what he built from love, not power. Leonard was still the same man who once stormed through a crowd to untie her, but now he had softened in ways no one else had ever seen. His beard had a few streaks of silver, and his suits had relaxed to fine cotton shirts, and sleeves rolled to his elbows, especially when he sat beneath the trees sketching plans for the next dormitory or teaching business courses on ethical leadership. Yet, no matter how busy, every morning without fail, he would find her somewhere on the property. Whether she was tending to a new student, resting beneath the vines, or sipping tea under the mosaic archway, and he would kneel beside her, lift her wrist, press his lips against the inner curve, and whisper 3 words that never aged, still priceless, love. And every time Zariah would smile as if hearing them for the first time. Their love had grown, yes, but it had also deepened, weathered, matured. They had built a life not on escape, but on return, choosing every day to invest back into the very soil that once rejected them. And now that soil bloomed endlessly with gratitude. Their mansion remained atop the hill overlooking the ocean and the village, its windows wide open to the sea breeze, its halls filled with art and music and laughter, especially the kind that came in high-pitched giggles and tiny footsteps thudding through corridors. For Zariah and Leonard had been gifted with twins, a boy and girl born on a rainy night that lit the sky with thunder, as if the heavens themselves were announcing that love had multiplied. Their names were Sol and Seren, sun and star. Sol had his father's brows and fire, but his mother's patience. Serene had Zariah's eyes and Leonard's mischief, often seen hiding under tables with a paintbrush or creating elaborate flower crowns for her mother. The children grew up not with arrogance but with awe, raised by parents who taught them that gentleness was power and that love was not entitlement, but honor. Every day the twins ran barefoot through the flower fields planted behind the mansion, giggling as they chased butterflies or wrestled in the soft grass, calling out to their mother from afar with a nickname that melted her every time. Queen Mama. Zariah would look up from her journal or cup of tea and raise her hand in a mock regal wave, to which they would bow dramatically before collapsing into laughter. Leonard would often join them, pulling both into his arms, kissing their heads and saying, "You two are the wildest pieces of our quietest miracle." And Zariah would reply with a knowing smile, "Let them be wild. The world tried to cage me, and I'll never let it happen to them." Their home was not a palace of riches. It was a kingdom of recovery. On the walls hung not portraits of ancestors or titles, but framed quotes from village girls who had graduated, built their own businesses, become lawyers, midwives, poets, and educators. Some signed their letters to Zariah with lines like, "Because of you, I believed I could survive." And others simply wrote, "I saw myself in you." Evenings in the Bloom Drake household were rituals of soulfulness. They dined under the stars, sometimes just the 4 of them, other times joined by staff, friends, or students who needed family more than formality. Music always played, violin, harp, sometimes Serene's soft piano. And every night, once the twins had fallen asleep, Zariah and Leonard would retire to their terrace, where soft cushions and warm drinks waited, and they would curl up beneath woven blankets, her legs stretched across his lap, his hand lazily tracing circles along her shin. The sea's hush was their lullaby. Fireflies blinked in the lavender shrubs, and in those moments when the world had finally gone quiet, Zariah would often lean close, kiss his collarbone, and whisper the words she never stopped meaning. Thank you for coming that day. And every time Leonard would close his eyes, press his lips to her shoulder, and answer without hesitation, I was always yours, even before the jet. The phrase had become their eternity promise, a private verse in the song only they understood. Because before the chopper, before the mansion, before the applause and the legacy and the empire they built together, there was only one thing that began everything, his love finding her in her ruin and never letting go. Years passed, but her name never faded. In the village, her story became bedtime lore. How the girl tied to a post became the queen of a movement. Children drew pictures of her. Her plaque still stood, now decorated each month with fresh lilies from students. Her birthday became a day of celebration, not with gifts, but with service. Girls would write essays about dignity and plant trees in her name. Leonard's Academy expanded to 3 more regions, each with murals of Zariah and quotes from her first speech. And yet, she never sought credit. She only wanted their daughters to know they were not made for cages. She only wanted them to believe in phoenixes. And when she walked through the town square now, her twins at each side, the air shifted not with whispers of shame, but with hymns of reverence. On their 20th anniversary, Leonard surprised her with a single carved stone at the edge of the garden. It read, Here rose Zariah Bloom, proof that some women don't just survive history, they rewrite it. And as she knelt before it, tears in her eyes, her arms suddenly wrapped in the embrace of her children, and Leonard behind her whispering, You are not a chapter in this world, Zariah. You are the entire story. She knew. She had found everything she once thought she'd lost. Dignity, home, love, and a place that no longer mocked her name but built dreams upon it. She had gone from ashes to legacy, from silence to echo, from broken to crowned, in the hearts of all